Well, good morning. So I bring you greetings from a distant land called Roman Catholicism. Now, for some of you, this might be a land that you once lived in and have migrated elsewhere. For others, it's an exotic place you've only heard rumors of, maybe seen a few pictures. But I was not always a Roman Catholic. So it's a place I migrated to. Sometimes theologians talk about the ecumenical gift exchange, what different Christian traditions can offer to each other. So I come to you this morning in the spirit of an ecumenical gift exchange to offer you a few things that I consider treasures from my tradition, to receive from you the treasures of your traditions, and I hope we'll all go away much enriched. So, growing up in South Carolina in the 1970s, as I did, one was likely to find in various public venues, particularly for some reason in restrooms, religious tracts in the form of small comic books created by one Jack T. Chick. Has anybody here ever seen these before? Okay, we've got a few Chick tract aficionados. Now, these were evangelistic tools that invariably followed a plot line that began with someone living an unchristian life by, for example, being a criminal or a bon vivant or a Roman Catholic, or celebrating Halloween, or believing in evolution, or playing rock and roll. And this person living the unchristian life would either repent and pray the sinner's prayer, which was helpfully included in each tract, or they would die and appear before the heavenly throne room, by which point it's too late to pray the sinner's prayer and they end up in hell. Now, I had no particular religious allegiance for much of my youth, so I took something of an outsider's interest in these tracts. The illustrations were lurid and funny, and the worldview presented was so extreme that it helped confirm me in my lack of religion. I had no immediate plans on becoming a bon vivant, a criminal, or a Roman Catholic, but I certainly was in favor of Halloween and rock and roll, as well as evolution. So these suggested that Christianity was not for me. But beyond that, there was one aspect of these comics that particularly struck me. God was depicted as a large human being who had no face. To my teenage mind, this faceless depiction seemed somehow both naive and yet unsettling, uncanny, unforgettably anthropomorphic, and at the same time, profoundly disturbing in its facelessness. Now, many years later, I would learn that the 20th century scholar of religion, Rudolf Otto, defined the holy as a mystery both terrifyingly, could we go back to the previous slide for a second? A mystery both profoundly terrifyingly overwhelming, and at the same time fascinating. And so perhaps I have to credit Jack Chick, despite his hatred of Catholics and rock and roll, for giving me one of my first glimpses of what the holy might be. I was not moved to pray the sinner's prayer, but it did get my attention. Now, over time, after finding my way into Christianity, and then into its Roman Catholic expression, I came to see that the God of Jack Chick's heavenly throne room, for all his fascinating, terrifying holiness, lacked more than simply a face. Because he lacked a face, he lacked something essential to the Christian notion of God. The faceless God could not be the God who is love. More precisely, he lacked what we human beings need in order to perceive love, for it's in the face of the other that we discover love. What it is to be loved and what it is to love. Even if someone assured us that the faceless God loved us very deeply, we could not experience that love, nor could we return to him love without gazing into a face, and specifically into a human face, in which we can experience that complex interplay of identity and difference that love is. Aristotle said, a friend is another self. I don't think I really understood the Christian claim that God is love until I figured out that God has a human face, and it's the face of Jesus. The anthropologist T.M. Luhrmann, in her fascinating book, How God Becomes Real, says that religions of all sorts share two features. Religions consist of practices by which people go to effort to make contact with an invisible other, and those who practice these religions want to feel differently than they do. They want to feel a connection to the invisible world of that invisible other. They want that world to take on something like visibility, though not exactly the visibility of trees or rocks or refrigerators. She also notes that most theories of religion developed by the great secular scholars of religion, think of Sigmund Freud, Emile Durkheim, William James, they all presume that a belief in invisible spiritual forces comes naturally to us and with relative ease. Because these theorists generally also think that these beliefs in an invisible other are more or less mistaken, there is no invisible other, they then come up with theories that go to great lengths to explain why it is that people so readily believe in something that is so obviously wrong. It often turns out to involve a lack of scientific knowledge. Now, Luhrmann, in contrast, questions the assumption that belief comes naturally and with relative ease, and is then that belief the motivation for religious practice. She says that if one actually looks at how believers of all sorts behave, praying, singing, fasting, and how they account for their behavior, it begins to look like belief is not the beginning of religious practice, but the end. The great secular theorists of religion presume that people have a belief in invisible beings and therefore they worship them. But what if people worship in order to make belief possible? What if faith is hard and requires narratives and disciplines and rituals in order to kindle a sense of the invisible other as real? Or, as I might put the question with Jack Chick in mind, what if narratives and disciplines and rituals are needed so that the faceless God might acquire a face? Now, Luhrmann, of course, writes as an anthropologist, though somebody recently told me that she has come out publicly as a Christian, but she writes as an anthropologist, not a believer. And so she focuses on human behavior, not divine behavior. She presents her analysis as what one might call belief neutral, arguing neither for nor against the existence of these invisible others. For the believer, however, there might be something uncomfortable about the notion that our actions kindle belief in God. For the Christian believer, God acquires a face not through anything we do, right? But by emptying himself and taking the form of a servant, by taking flesh and dwelling among us full of grace and truth, by becoming like his brothers and sisters in every way except sin, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest before God. Surely the reason we're not left with a faceless God is because God has given himself a human face in Jesus of Nazareth, in that mysterious event that we call incarnation. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, it is the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. The experience of God's face turned toward us in Jesus is not something that we can or need to generate out of ourselves, for it is God who regenerates us as a new creation. Yet, all that being said, the life of prayer is still something we human beings engage in. And our engagement, from quiet meditation to ritual action to singing God's praises together, our engagement seems to make some difference. The psalmist prays, "Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. Come," my heart says, "seek his face." Our theological convictions might tell us that Christianity is about God seeking us and not about us seeking God. It was constantly repeated by Karl Barth. But our heart says, "Come seek his face." And as Blaise Pascal wrote, the heart has its reasons about which reason knows nothing. Indeed, Pascal counseled the agnostic, the skeptic of whom Tyler spoke last night, the one to whom reason suggests that just playing the odds, you probably ought to believe, but you just can't make yourself do it. Pascal suggested to such a person to seek the Lord's face by engaging in religious practice even before you believe. He writes, "You would like to find faith and do not know the way? You would like to be cured of unbelief and ask for the remedies? Learn from those who were bound like you and who now wager all they have. Follow the way by which they began. They acted as if they believed, took holy water, had masses said, etc. This will make you believe naturally and mechanically." You could probably change those Catholic-specific practices to things like sing praise choruses or devote an hour to biblical reading. But in any case, that last word that Pascal uses, that I stuck in the French, abattre, it literally means like an animal. And different translators translate it different ways, mechanically, docilely, according to your animal reaction. Like M.T. Luhrmann, Pascal believed that worship is the source of belief, not the result. And he thought that belief has to move from the realm of conscious effort and become something like an instinct in us. And the way this movement occurred was by human beings engaging in practices of prayer that loosened their attachment to the things of this world and opened up the door to another world. Of course, Pascal believed that human beings could do nothing without God's grace. In fact, he believed this so firmly that some of his fellow Catholics suspected him of being a secret Calvinist. But he also knew from experience that if human beings were to pass from a merely rational, notional belief that there is probably a God to a true belief in God, a belief that is joined to love of God, this would likely involve what 12-step programs call faking it till you make it. Engaging in prayer, particularly more ritualized forms of prayer, whether a formal liturgy or singing praise choruses together. Even when you're not feeling it, even prior to full intellectual conviction. In the mysterious alchemy that is prayer, human action and God's grace somehow coincide, such that our seeking of God's face and God's turning of his face to us in Jesus fuse into one single action. Now, if this is true, if prayer practices are a source and not a fruit of belief, then our belief that God is not faceless, our conviction that God is love, our faith that we've been given knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, those convictions have to spring from prayer. The practices of prayer that have developed over the centuries in the Christian tradition are numerous and varied, and I don't think that there is one that is the magic key that unlocks belief for us. But I want to focus on a form of devotion that's developed in my own Catholic tradition that focuses on the face of Jesus. Now, the face of Jesus is mentioned in several places in the Gospels. It shines like the sun at the Transfiguration. It's set toward Jerusalem as he and his disciples journey from Galilee. It is struck and spat upon by his torturers. Seemingly, it goes unrecognized by Mary Magdalene in the garden until Jesus speaks her name. But it's the crucified face of Jesus, the face of Jesus that is the target of human abuse, the marred and suffering face of Jesus that has typically been the focus of devotion in Catholicism. I want to give 3 different examples of people, women who lived in various times and places, who focused their prayer on the face of Jesus in order to show the variety of ways in which we might answer our heart's cry, "Come, seek his face." So first, Julian of Norwich, a favorite of mine. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on her. She was an English woman who lived in the 14th century, around the time of the Black Death. And she received, over the period of about a day, a series of visions, or as she called them, showings. These visions were focused on the crucified form of Jesus. Many of them were transformations that she perceived in a physical crucifix that she was looking at. And in one of these, she sees the face of Jesus changing color as he dies. She writes, "I saw his sweet face, as it were, dry and bloodless with pale dying, and later more pale, dead, languoring, and then turned more dead unto blue, and then more brown blue as the flesh turned more deeply dead. For his passion showed me most specifically in his blessed face. This was a pitiful change to see, this deep dying." The pain of Jesus, like any human being's pain, is seen most clearly in the face. And as his life ebbs away, his face changes. Its color drains away, and then it darkens as the lifeless flesh dries. Julian mentions that the sight of Jesus' face brought to mind what she refers to as the Holy Vernicle in Rome, which was a relic purported to be the handkerchief with which a woman named Veronica had wiped the face of Jesus as he carried his cross, and upon which the image of his face had been imprinted. If you're wondering where this is in the Bible, don't worry, it's not in the Bible. But it is the focus of the 6th century, the 6th Station of the Cross, which is good enough for Catholics. Now, there's a long tradition of artistic representations of this holy cloth, so Julian undoubtedly had a reservoir of visual images upon which she could draw, various images of a face that imprints itself upon the matter of the world. Julian does not tell us a lot about any particular technique she used in praying, but she does tell us that for many, many years after having her visions, she used to call them to mind and scrutinize them, examine them, much as someone would examine a text, the way you might pore over a biblical passage, or a great painting. The face of Jesus is for Julian a kind of living icon that she can contemplate within her imagination. And the insight she gained from this practice of prayerful reimagining becomes so incorporated in her memory of the vision that she tells us she cannot really separate what we might want to call the original vision from her later contemplation of it. It all becomes part of one way of God revealing himself. So her account of her revelations are a kind of palimpsest, to use a technical term, a layering of texts, visions and revisions undertaken as she seeks the face of Jesus in prayer. And what she sees as she contemplates his face is the immense love that leads God to take on our human suffering. She writes, "He would, for love and worship of man, make himself as like to man in this deadly life, in our foulness and our wretchedness, as man might be without guilt. This is that which is meant when it is said afore, it was the image and likeness of our foul black deeds' shame, wherein our fair, bright, blessed Lord God was hid." The face she sees is one whose beauty is covered over by all the suffering that sin causes. It causes us to perpetrate upon others, and which sin perpetrates upon ourselves. But the beauty shows through the horror because Jesus takes on this suffering out of love for us. To paraphrase Athanasius of Alexandria, Christ becomes what we are, the image and likeness of sin, so that we might become what he is, the image of the invisible God. For Julian, the whole point of the incarnation is this exchange of images. Christ takes a human face so that the Father might see in us the face of his beloved Son. Julian's practice of prayer, including her contemplation of the dying face of Jesus, is one that leads her to a belief that sin is kind of like a wound that we suffer, and that God is not primarily interested in blaming us for, but rather in healing our suffering by taking it on himself. Her God is not the faceless God of the heavenly courtroom, but the God who has given himself the face of human suffering so that he might bring us into joy. Now, some 500 years after Julian, another young woman, Thérèse Martin, also contemplated the face of Jesus. She's known by many names, so I put all her aliases up there. Thérèse, who was born in France in 1873, had been an extraordinarily pious child from an extraordinarily pious family. And at the age of 15 became a Carmelite nun, taking the name Thérèse of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. From her diary, published after her death, we know that she developed a spirituality of what she called the little way. She saw herself as in no way capable of following the example of the great heroic saints like Joan of Arc, patron saint of the nation of France. She sought to follow Christ instead by a little way, by bringing his love into everyday mundane tasks that she undertook in her daily life, from washing dishes to singing in the choir. In 1896, she contracted tuberculosis, from which she died a year later at age 24. But added to her physical suffering, which was great, was a much deeper spiritual suffering that she recounts in her diary, a loss of any sense of God's presence. The dark mirror through which we all see in this life grew for her even darker. It was as if God became for her faceless. And she said that she felt as if she knew now from within what it must be like to be an atheist. She said that when she looked up, where she once saw heaven, she now saw only sky. So I guess she didn't just become an atheist, she became John Lennon. Yet she did not give up her belief. Indeed, she saw this experience as a deepening and purification of her belief. The prayers that she uttered in the midst of this spiritual desolation sprang not from any feeling, no interior sweetness or delight, but solely from an act of will. The longing for God's face that we all experience in this life became for her an insatiable hunger. In one of her prayers, she writes, "O Jesus, whose face is the sole beauty that ravishes my heart, I may not see here below the sweetness of your glance, nor feel the ineffable tenderness of your kiss. I bow to your will. But I pray you to imprint in me your divine likeness, and I implore you to so inflame me with your love that it may quickly consume me, and that I may soon reach the vision of your glorious face in heaven." Teresa's practice of prayer in her final days was a practice of pure desire. She suggests that the face of Jesus itself was hidden from her. Obviously, of course, she could look at holy images of his face. She could bring them into her imagination. But these were images without presence. Seemingly unlike Julian, she had no felt sense that conjuring the face of Jesus in her mind's eye was in any way connecting her to God. She saw no glance of his eyes falling upon her. She felt no spiritual kiss from his lips. Yet she knew that the imprint of his image was still upon her. For she, like him, accepted God's will, even as she cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We're in Christ's image when we cry out that way. If we think of prayer as a conversation with God, her prayer took the form of a desire for a conversation which had been cut off. With each passing moment of divine silence, her desire was kindled, and she yearned to see once more the face of her beloved. This desire for her was like a fire that consumes even as it purifies. And it brought her into solidarity with those who do not believe. She knew what it felt like not to believe. In this prayer of pure desire, it is as if God were stripping her of her youthful piety so that she might experience a faith that goes beyond mere belief, the faith of those who, as Pascal put it, wager all they have. Less than 60 years after the death of Therese Martin, an Englishwoman named Carol Houselander, dying from cancer, wrote a short book of meditations on the Stations of the Cross. Houselander was a writer and an artist who, despite any formal psychoanalytic training, had gained a reputation during the Second World War as a counselor of soldiers suffering from what was then called shell shock and what we today would call post-traumatic stress disorder. Her method, inasmuch as she had one, was simply to accept these soldiers for who they were, for who she knew them to be, horribly damaged images of Christ. As the head of the British Psychiatric Association put it after her death, she loved them back to life. She was a divine eccentric. And if you read her own account of her life, she was definitely eccentric. Houselander had long loved the Stations of the Cross as a form of prayer. And she said they were given to us not only to remind us of the historical passion of Christ, but to show us what is happening now and happening in each one of us. In her reflection on the sixth station, that one where the legendary Veronica wipes the face of Jesus, she focuses on the moment of face-to-face encounter in which Veronica looks into the face of Jesus, the face that she's just wiped the blood and sweat and tears away from. The face that once shone with glory on Mount Tabor, but is now transfigured by human violence, almost beyond recognition. But while that disfigured face had repelled even his closest followers, who fled in fear and disgrace, it awakened in Veronica, Houselander writes, a compassion that allows her to see beyond the blood and the bruises, a face that is serene in its suffering, calm, majestic, infinitely tender. It's not a face of weakness, though. It's a face of power. She writes, the power of Christ is able to control fiercer storms than those of the wind and the sea. It is able to still the torrents of evil of the whole world in the stillness of his own heart. It is the power which enables him to command the floods of all the sorrow in the world and hold them in peace. It is the power which can not only give back life to the dead, but can change death itself into life. It is the power of divine love. Because Veronica can move beyond her horror and revulsion to compassion, this divine power is communicated to her so that it is no longer she who lives, but Christ who lives in her. Because she is convinced that the story of Christ's suffering is not something from the distant past, but something that is being lived out in our own day, Houselander reflects on what she calls the Veronicas of today, those who can press beyond horror at suffering to compassion, so as to discover the divine power of Christ at work in all of the suffering of the world and at work in themselves. Undoubtedly, she speaks from her own encounter with souls maimed by the violence of war, when she says that we find in the sick and the elderly, the abused child and the persecuted, the face of Christ. But Houselander also recognizes that while suffering can ennoble us, it can also degrade us. She doesn't sentimentalize suffering. It is the task of our world's Veronicas to care not only for the physical wounds of the suffering, but also care for the mental and emotional and spiritual wounds, so that the suffering can discover the power and the dignity that they have, even in their suffering, the power and dignity of bearing the image of Christ. The Veronicas of today wipe the blood from the eyes of the suffering so that their eyes can see in our eyes the truth of what they are, the living face of Christ among us. So 3 different women living in 3 different times and cultures, but also 3 different practices of prayer focused on the face of Jesus. Julian shows us how contemplative meditation on the face of Jesus can kindle in us a belief in the depths of God's love for all humanity, a love that is willing to suffer infinitely for the sake of the beloved. Therese shows us how the mere desire to pray, the desire to see the hidden face of Jesus, can itself be a prayer that strengthens in us the belief that God is present, even in the experience of divine absence. And Carol Houselander shows us that seeking the face of Jesus in the face of the poor and the suffering, and acting to alleviate that suffering, is also a form of prayer, a way of encountering the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. These 3 ways of seeking the face of Jesus, among countless others, can kindle our belief in the God who is no faceless deity in a heavenly courtroom, but the God who has shown his face to us and shows us that he is love. So I pray this morning that this God who is love, this God who is mercy, would have mercy on us all. Thank you.